Welcome back again. It's Brian Hurd, author of a new book entitled Avoiding the Aging Parent Trap. My book deals with tips, tricks and traps in relation to the issues you as adult children will have to confront when dealing with your aging parents and the needs and demands that they will come with in later life. One of the things that really concerns me, particularly as a lawyer, is the failure of families to prepare for these later life events. We have families who I call waiters. They wait for something to happen. They can see their parents declining and they cross their fingers and close their eyes and even pray to their God about the fact that their parents will not end up in a dependent, reliant situation. We even have children who are what we call watchers. They watch their parents decline. They tend to be children who are not here. In other words, they're somewhere else. They feel disconnected and they can often rely on the other siblings to provide that necessary support. The traps themselves can be many and varied depending on the dynamics of your family. The bigger your family, the more significant those traps can be. But one of the most interesting traps is the failure of children, adult children, to prepare for their aging parents. The reality is there's a general malaise amongst families to fail to prepare. And when you fail to prepare, what happens is when the event occurs with your parents, as it will inevitably as they get older, you are unprepared for that event. You then enter what's called crisis management mode, where you simply have to respond very quickly, very urgently, without any knowledge or information as to how to respond, what the options are to respond, and then you make the worst decisions possible because they're made in a state of urgency or emergency, and they're never well considered. For example, basic legal things. Mum and Dad, do you have a will? Mum and Dad, do you have an enduring power of attorney? Mum and Dad, do you have an advance health directive? They may sound like cliches, but the reality is it needs to be raised. It needs adult children to have the courage to raise it with their parents in the face of, for example, suspicion from their siblings about what the child is really up to, and even resistance from their parents about being involved in making sure those documents are in place. Can I give you an example from the book? An 84-year-old woman who was a widow some years ago had 4 adult children. 3 of them were lawyers. One of them was a social worker. They called her the black sheep. The mother ran a very large family company, and she was elderly at 84, and she continued to do so. She was very controlling. She controlled everything about the company. One day she was sitting at her desk, signing checks, and slumped to the desk. She had a stroke. She was taken to hospital. She was in a vegetative state. Suddenly, it was realized that not having done an enduring power of attorney, Mum had left the company in a black legal hole, frozen in time. Because without that document in place, the law says nobody, not one person in the world, including her children, could make financial decisions for her. The consequences were disastrous. It required the children to apply to a tribunal to be appointed her administrator in order to keep the company running, which of course it stopped. The consequence of that was, because there was a dispute between the children as to who should make that application, all 4 of them made the application in competition with each other. The consequence of that was disastrous. Firstly, the tribunal didn't appoint any of them. They appointed a trustee, a public trustee. The consequence further was that the legal costs involved, because they were competing against each other, were over $400,000. But the real damage to this family, the real damage, was the breakdown of their relationships. None of the children talk to each other anymore, and the mother doesn't see many of them anymore. So the reality was the failure by Mum to do something quite basic resulted in the implosion of her family. The problem with many Australian families is that they focus on the price of doing something as opposed to the cost of doing nothing. And this is a classic story from my book to illustrate the enormous cost of doing nothing.